The headline ran, unexpected. Unexpected is exactly what they never anticipated. A young couple named Mike and Alexa had the unexpected thing happen. They were enjoying life just like any young couple would enjoy life, but Mike had recently had back surgery. And because he had back surgery, he was laid up. He was laid up on the couch, couldn't do much other than just ask his wife to make sure that he was comfortable. But then one evening, Lexi began to have abdominal pain. And as she had that pain, she kind of ignored it in the moment, thinking, oh, maybe I'm just tired. I'm exhausted. I'm worn out. I've been taking care of my husband. But the pain continued. The pain got so severe that she decided to call her mom. Mom, I'm hurting. I don't know what to do. The pain is more than I could handle. Should I go to the emergency room? What should I do? Her mom said, don't worry. I'll be over in just a minute. And when her mom arrived, what did she do? She found her daughter in sweatpants, relaxed on the couch, taking care of her husband, herself in pain. Her mom decides, you know what? I think the best thing for you is to go to the hospital, but I'm not taking you looking like that. You need to go change. So she changes and they head out and they go to the hospital. When they get to the ER, the pain is so severe that they wheeled Lexi back and they began to examine her. And through the process, her mom decided to help out and she began answering all the registration questions to get her checked in. And a nurse came out and the conversation went something like this. The head is crowning. Whose head? The mom said. The nurse, the baby's head. The mom, what baby? Your daughter's baby. My daughter's baby? My daughter's not pregnant. Yes, she is, and it won't be much longer because she's delivering right now. A beautiful girl came into the world without the mom even being aware that she was pregnant. Doctors examined the baby and they determined that the baby was likely born a couple of weeks past its due date. Meanwhile, Mike's back home on the couch. He has no clue what's happening, what's taking place. Little did he know that he was about to get the call of a lifetime. To be honest, it was a good thing that he was already laying down. Whenever this story is told, and again, this is a true story, most women hearing this would say, this is impossible. There's no way that she could have known that not known that she was pregnant. And you may ask yourself, why do you open up with such a story like this? Because Luke begins his gospel in Luke chapter 1 with a surprise. The unexpected. Everybody was going about their business, living their life, doing their normal day-to-day, not anticipating what was about to happen. And so we find ourselves on this scene with a couple. Not a young couple like Lexi and Mike, but a couple who was in years into their life. Elizabeth and Zachariah. And they had an encounter that would change their life forever, an encounter that they had probably been hoping and wishing would have happened years earlier, but for some reason it didn't. So if you have your Bibles this morning, I want to encourage you to open to Luke chapter 1, and we're going to jump into verse 5. And as I said, we're going to see a couple here by the name of Elizabeth and Zachariah. And this is what it says in Luke chapter 1, starting in verse 5. It says, in the time of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zachariah who belonged to the priestly division of Abijah. His wife Elizabeth was also a descendant of Aaron. Both of them were righteous in the sight of God, observing all the Lord's commands and decrees blamelessly. But they were childless because Elizabeth was not able to conceive, and they were both very old. Once when Zachariah's division was on duty, he was serving as priest before God. He was chosen by Lot, according to the custom of the priesthood, to go into the temple of the Lord and burn incense. And when the time for the burning of the incense came, all the assembled worshipers were praying outside. Then an angel of the Lord appeared to him, standing at the right side of the altar of incense. When Zechariah saw him, he was startled and he was gripped with fear. But the angel said to him, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah. Your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you will call him John. He will be a joy and a delight to you, and many will rejoice because of his birth. For he will be great in the sight of the Lord. He is never to take wine or other fermented drink, and he will be filled with the Holy Spirit even before he is born. He will bring back many of the people of Israel to the Lord their God. He will go before the Lord in the spirit and the power of Elijah, to turn the hearts of the parents to their children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the righteous, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord." Zechariah asked the same thing I would ask if I was in his shoes. "How can I be sure of this? I'm an old man and my wife is well along in years." The angel said to him, "I am Gabriel, and I stand in the presence of God, and I have been sent to speak to you and to tell you this good news. And now you will be silent and not able to speak until the day this happens, because you did not believe my words, which will come true at their appointed time." Meanwhile, the people were waiting for Zechariah and wondering why he stayed so long in the temple. When he came out, he could not speak to them. They realized he had seen a vision in the temple, for he kept making signs to them, but remained unable to speak. When his time of service was completed, he returned home. After this, his wife Elizabeth became pregnant. For 5 months, remained in seclusion. "The Lord has done this for me," she said. "In these days, he has shown his favor and taken away my disgrace among the people." So this morning we meet a priest named Zechariah and his wife Elizabeth. And we discover 3 things really quickly about this couple. We discover that they are righteous, that they walk blamelessly before God, that they follow all of his commandments and his statutes. It says that they are well in their years, well advanced in their years, that they are older. And the last thing that we discover is that they are childless. In the Bible, it says she is barren, simply struggling to have a baby. And here's what I've discovered about this open heartache. For so many that have this same struggle, it's punctuated by 1,000 unseen disappointments. The years had waned on. Hope for this couple had slowly extinguished like a candle deprived of oxygen. It's not where they expected to be. I'm sure early on in their marriage, much like most couples, their hope and their anticipation was to have a child, to have a family, to call their own. I know what it's like. And what we discover early on is in this process, there's a lot of waiting. A lot of years had gone by. And I'm sure every time they were just simply waiting and hoping with some sort of excitement. But you know that the longer you wait, the excitement disappears. I don't know about you, but I don't like to wait. But I've got this problem. Every line I pick will be the longest line and the slowest line. We always have to wait. And my wife always tells me it doesn't matter if it's in the car, the grocery store, the department store, my kids' school, it doesn't matter. I always get the slowest line, and we always have to wait the longest. And it drives me crazy. And my wife always looks at me and she says, "Why do you pick the lines?" "Because I get here first. You're still getting stuff, so I just want to get in line because I know I'm going to wait." But I can only imagine what they felt like waiting. Waiting and hoping for this miracle to happen. But what we discover is this layer of disappointment that was described as disgrace. See, barren was almost always blamed on the woman. And in that culture, there was a legitimate cause for grounds of divorce. See, one of the things that they would say often in their culture, it went something like this: God blesses the righteous. God's greatest blessing is children. And if you're childless, there must be something wrong with you on levels God can only see. See, never mind the fact that as you open up the scriptures, we discover there were others before Elizabeth that had experienced the exact same thing. I mean, if you were here the very first week in this series, Christmas Presents, we discovered that with Sarah and Abram, or as we know him as Abraham. That this was not something new. And we often can feel something like Elizabeth, where we feel the same pain, the same shed. I wonder how many tears she had shed in silence when nobody else was around, when nobody else could feel the pain that was welling up in her so deeply that it caused her to express it in a way that just seemed unnormal. But even more than that, the public humiliation, the fingers that were being pointed at her. Oh, there goes Elizabeth again. Did you know she can't have kids? Something must be wrong with her. God must not love her as much as he loves me. And I know when I read something like this, for most of us, we're like, well, my story looks nothing like Elizabeth's. We have kids. Or we don't want kids, or whatever it may be. My story looks nothing like hers, but I beg to differ because it does. How many of us have experienced shame? You don't have to answer. How many of you have had people talk about you behind your back? How many of you have walked past a crowd knowing that they were speaking of you in a negative light? How many of you have felt pain and sorrow and disappointment because something didn't turn out the way that you had planned or expected or even had been dreaming your entire life to be? My wife and I, after we had our first son, and we waited a long time to have him, not because of my wife, but more because of me, because I didn't want kids. But we did. 7 years later, we had our first kid, and after having him, like most, my wife had a plan that 18 months later, we would have the next child. And I got to be honest, I loved trying to have kids. When she said, hey, let's have kids, I'm there, let's go. And I remember when we were about 9 months, 10 months into having our first son, she's like, all right, it's time. We're going for the second. I'm like, yes, we are. Let's do this. You're looking at me like I'm crazy. You know exactly what I'm talking about. All the men in the room, you know what I'm talking about. That's right. 9 months went by, still no child. 2 years went by, no child. 3 years went by, no child. And I can remember just sitting there week after week, day after day, feeling the pain that my wife was feeling because she just wanted another baby. She just wanted it. And 4 years went by. And we just waited. And we just waited, and we just waited. And then 5 years, we had our next son. But it was a season that was hard. It was a season like none other that we had experienced. See, never mind all that she had experienced, all the private tears that she had shed, all the snares that she had endured. It was there in her pain that I'm sure she felt hopeless and alone. But here's what I've discovered about that place of pain. That place of our deepest pain is where God tends to work the most. Because I have to imagine for Elizabeth and even for Zechariah, their dependence on God. What we learn and we discover early on about them is it says they were righteous, they were blameless before God. That they followed all that he had asked, all their commandments that he had asked of them, they followed it. They lived their lives in such obedience to him, but yet they still felt deep pain. And many of us can relate to Elizabeth. We can feel something like she did or something different deep within our world and our hearts. And for some of us, we can stand before God with feelings of bitterness, simply asking, God, what have you done? God, what have you done? Or maybe guilt. God, what have I done? What have I done to deserve this or to not deserve this? And this was Elizabeth. I'm sure she went before him year after year asking those same two questions. God, what have you done? What have I done? Waiting on God's presence, it's hard. But waiting on God's presence, we can find hope. We can find hope in a place of good news. And we should be encouraged that God chose this unlikely couple to begin to tell the Christmas story. The good news of God's presence. The story of Jesus' birth. It begins in the most unexpected place. In the womb of a barren woman. A woman who had dreamed her entire life of having her own family. In this place of her deepest pain, it becomes the place where God works. And the same thing is true for you and for me. Elizabeth had been waiting her entire adult life to have children. And for them, waiting was normal, just like waiting is normal for us. For centuries, God's people had been waiting for God to come near to them in a special way. They were waiting for him to take away their sorrow and to replace it with joy. They were waiting for him to take away their sin and replace it with forgiveness. They were waiting for him to take away the barrenness of death and replace it with abundant life. Here's what I've discovered about waiting. Waiting is where faith becomes necessary to overcome the pain. Waiting is where faith becomes necessary for you and I to overcome the pain. It was in her waiting that God was about to do something unexpected. It was in her waiting that maybe she finally came to the realization, this is it. Zechariah, we're never going to have children, and I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that. I don't care what other people think or what other people may say about me. I'm okay. Even in the middle of her waiting and all the pain, and again, all the tears that she had shed, he would begin to use Elizabeth to bring humanity wholeness, healing, and ultimately joy. It wasn't Elizabeth who would bring Jesus into the world, but it was her son that would prepare the way. And the time for waiting is over. But it's hard to wait because you and I are control freaks, even if you won't admit it. We control as much as we possibly can, but when things are out of our control, it stresses us out. It causes us to run to other things or other places than God. But Elizabeth must have ran to God over and over and over again. Otherwise, why would he say that she was blameless? And she continued to run to him. And it was in this unexpected place that the time for waiting was over. And I could only imagine how both Elizabeth and Zechariah must have felt. Joy, confusion, doubt. I mean, we know that it was real in Zechariah. The angel says, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. this is not what I expected when I came in here. I just came to do my job. And like most of us, if we had received the same thing that he had received, hey, guess what? Your wife's going to have a baby. Yeah, right. Do you know how old she is? Do you know how old I am? You must have us confused with another couple. It's not us. Because of your doubts, you're not going to speak. You're not going to speak. So confusion, doubt, fear. The list goes on, but look what happens when you jump to verse 57. It says, when it was time for Elizabeth to have her baby, she gave birth to a son. Her neighbors and her relatives heard that the Lord had shown her great mercy, and they shared her joy. Isn't it strange that just earlier they said something was wrong with her, but now they're quick to run and to celebrate? It's just interesting to me. It's interesting that in 1 minute we're piling shame on her for what she cannot do or who she cannot become. And you know what that's like. You know what it's like for people to pile shame on you, to point fingers at you and say, you'll never measure up. You'll never be enough. And then the tables turn. We're going to celebrate with you. We're going to share this joy. And it says on the 8th day, they came to circumcise the child, and they were going to name him after his father Zechariah. But his mother spoke up and said, no, he is to be called John. They said to her, there is no one among your relatives who has that name. Then they made signs to his father to find out what he would like to name the child. He asked for a writing tablet, and to everyone's astonishment, he wrote, his name is John. Immediately, his mouth was open and his tongue set free, and he began to speak, praising God. All the neighbors were filled with awe. And throughout the hill country of Judea, people were talking about all these things. Yeah, they were talking about it. Did you hear what happened? Elizabeth? It's so unexpected. Why did God choose them? Everyone who heard this wondered about it, asking, what then is this child going to be? For the Lord's hand is with him. I mean, it's amazing to me that here in this place, they had been waiting their entire life for this moment, and it was finally here. It was happening, not as they had expected, not when they were young and most able, but later in life. Later in life, when it was time for them to be grandparents, not parents. And then we get a glimpse of Zechariah's heart, of how he must have felt, and how he expressed what was going on, all the emotions. Could you imagine 9 months not being able to say a word? 9 months. You can't say anything. You can't tell anybody how you feel. And we can write it all that we want, but we know that our expressions verbally sometimes say so much more than whatever we write. And he couldn't. He couldn't have that conversation with Elizabeth. Babe, I'm so excited. It's here. It's finally here. Or, oh, this is crazy. We're too old for this. We're not supposed to be doing this now. Or who knows? Hey, what are we going to do to get John's room ready? How are we going to be prepared for this baby to come into this world? He couldn't do that. He just had to sit and wait. And then when the time came, when everybody expected John or Zechariah to name him after himself, no way. I was told in the temple that his name was going to be John, and his name is going to be John. And to everybody's amazement, he calls him John. And then we get a glimpse of how Zechariah must have felt. Even with all the knowledge that he had about those who had gone before him, that had been barren themselves, that had been without child. But there was a difference. There was a difference here for Zechariah, the difference between knowing God's promises intellectually and waiting on God's promises personally. And the same thing's true for you and me. We can say that we know it, but waiting for God to do what he's promised to do, that's so much harder. He had been waiting for a child his entire life. But those final 9 months of waiting must have been some of the most profound months of his life. In 9 months, he began to learn to hope again. In 9 months, he began to learn to be filled with joy and excitement. In 9 months, maybe he began to live again, not feeling like his life was coming to an end, but that his life was just about to begin. In 9 months, everything changed. And look at how he expresses it, picking up in verse 67. And this is really Zechariah's song. It's really poetry from his heart, an expression that he was filled with, that he had to exclaim to everyone that was around, and especially to God. It says this in verse 67, his father Zechariah was filled with the Holy Spirit and prophesied, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, because he has come to his people and redeemed them. He has raised up a horn of salvation for us in the house of his servant David. And he has said through his holy prophets of long ago, salvation from your enemies and from the hand of all who hate us, to show mercy to our ancestors and to remember his holy covenant, the oath he swore to our father Abraham, to rescue us from the hand of our enemies, to enable us to serve him without fear, in holiness and righteousness before him all our days. And you, my child, will be called a prophet of the Most High. For you will go before the Lord to prepare the way for him, to give his people the knowledge of salvation through the forgiveness of their sins, because of the tender mercy of our God, by which the rising sun will come to us from heaven, to shine on those living in darkness and in the shadow of death, to guide our feet into the path of peace." And then it says, and the child grew and became strong in spirit, and he lived in the wilderness until he appeared publicly to Israel. Zechariah began to express everything that he was holding in for 9 months. He began to express through this beautiful song that his son was finally born, and he erupted with joy. And through this song, he began to proclaim all of who God is and what God has done. See, Zechariah's song, it illustrates God's desire to offer provision to his people through the presence of Jesus. Though his son wasn't Jesus, God was using him to prepare the way for Jesus, for his people. And what we began to discover through this song is a couple really critical things. In verse 68, he talks about redemption. Redemption, to redeem his people. The very thing that they had been waiting on their entire life. That they would have hope again. Purpose and meaning, that they would have a connection with God that was like no other connection that they had had up to this point. He would redeem them. In verse 72, he would bring them mercy. He would show mercy that was undeserved, but freely given through Jesus. Mercy for you and for me. Mercy that we don't earn, but is given to us as a gift out of his love for us. And not only mercy, in verse 77, he says forgiveness. He extends forgiveness to all of humanity, to all of us. He prepares the way to show us that you and I deserve and desire forgiveness. And he expresses this through this song. And in verse 70, fulfillment of his promise. God is going to do what God has promised that he is going to do. But here's the thing about God's promises, and I don't want you to miss this. God's promises aren't our promises. What we typically do at times in our lives is we begin to create our promises of what we believe God has for us instead of what God has actually shown us. He's fulfilling the promise. He told the people, I will send my son, and he will come, and he will redeem you, and he will show you mercy, and he will extend forgiveness to you. I will fulfill the promise that I have said I will do. And then in verse 79, salvation is for everyone. Jesus came for everyone. The gospel is for everyone. Jesus came to die on the cross for everyone. Not for just the people that have figured out how to make themselves acceptable for God. Not for just the people who could dress right, act right, look right, and do the right things. But for people that recognize their brokenness before God. That say, here I am, God. I'm Elizabeth. I've walked through life without hope. I'm Elizabeth. I have walked through life feeling shame. I'm Elizabeth. I have walked through life feeling pain. I have walked through life waiting. And here's the thing about waiting. And when we talk about waiting, and when we begin to wade into the deep waters of waiting, especially into people's lives, it becomes personal. Time is precious. When we're looking forward to something in the future, whether it's relief, joy, removing the anxiety, waiting is difficult. See, much like Elizabeth and Zechariah, you might find yourself in a season of waiting. In a season where you don't feel God's presence. It's difficult. There's no way around it. We can make it look as pretty as we want, but it's difficult. See, despite circumstances and consequences, we need to let God work out his will in our life according to his timing. And just wait. Just wait for his presence. Just wait when everybody's pointing the finger at you and saying you're not enough. Just wait. Because he's saying you are enough. He's saying you are loved. He's saying you are my child. You are my son. You are my daughter. That in the waiting is where he will do some of his best work in your life and in mine. So the question is simple. What is it that you're waiting for? What are you waiting for? I believe for some today, you're waiting to receive Christ, and you're waiting for everything in your life to get perfect. Well, I can't come to Jesus because, man, you don't know the baggage that I'm carrying. You don't know where I've been. You don't know what I've done. You don't know what has been done to me. And if you did, you wouldn't accept me. And Jesus says, wait no longer, come. Come. Don't wait. Come just as you are. And so today, for some of you, the waiting has been waiting to give your life to Jesus. And I'm telling you, today's the day. And so maybe for you, the waiting is over. And you just simply need to trust Jesus with your life. Except that he came to die for your sins. He came to die for you because he loved you, but he conquered death and sin. Because when he died on that cross and they placed him in that tomb 3 days later, we celebrate the fact that he rose from the grave, that he conquered sin and death for you and for me. The waiting is over. He says you don't have to wait anymore. Maybe for you, the waiting is I've been waiting for the right time or the right moment to invite somebody to church. It's not the right season, things going on in their life, the things that they're dealing with. Our relationship isn't what it used to be. Why wait? When you and I have the hope that we have in Jesus, why wait? And so maybe today your next step is to invite somebody to Christmas Eve. Do you know statistically more people will come to Christmas Eve on an invitation, a personal invitation, than any other time? Why wait? So what is it that you're waiting for? I want to encourage you and challenge you today, respond. Wait no more. Today's the day. Will you pray with me? Father, Lord God, you can read something like this, and it's easy to say, well, I don't relate with that. But we do. We've had to wait, just like Elizabeth and Zechariah. We've waited. And waiting's been hard. And sometimes in the waiting, much like what they must have felt, we feel like your presence isn't there. But I love what your word says, that you will never leave us or forsake us, which means that you are always there even when we don't feel like it. And so today, God, I pray that we will respond, that you have been just waiting on us to respond to you. And that today, maybe there's somebody here in person or online that has bought into that lie that they have to get everything fixed. They have to clean up their life before they can come to you. I pray today that they will demolish that lie and they will run to you, that the waiting will be no more. And Father, for those that are waiting to invite somebody to Christmas Eve or to a service or into a conversation, a faith conversation, that they'll wait no more because you are with us. That your power as sons and daughters, as followers of Jesus, resides in us, that you unleash that within us to be able to go to do the impossible. So let us wait no more. And let us trust that you're in work at whatever it is that you're calling us to do. Father, continue to move and speak to us as we continue our worship before you. It's in Jesus' name that I pray. Amen.